Welcome to the Coach Doctor podcast, a podcast where we discuss aspects of sports coaching from grassroots to grandstands. I'm your host, James Barkell, and on this podcast, we hear from academics who research coaching. We talk to coaches on the front line from development levels through to professional coaches, and we discuss other elements of successful sporting programs with experts and practitioners from a range of sports science fields, motivational psychology, strength and conditioning, and many other elements required for successful performance. If you'd like to know more about what we do at the Coach Doctor, you can visit our website, thecoachdoctor.com.au, and learn more about our services, or follow me on Instagram at thecoachdr or Twitter at James_Barkell for more regular information. Before I start the episode, I just wanted to let all the coaches and athletes out there know about a special deal that we've got going with Elite Performance Journals. EPJ make both coaches' notepads ideal for developing session plans and for reviewing or reflecting on sessions. And for athletes looking for that extra edge, they also have an Elite Athlete Journal designed around specific needs of up-and-coming professional athletes. For any listeners of the Coach Doctor podcast, you can receive 20% off on any of their products by simply going to eliteperformancejournal.com, check out all of their products, and when you check out, use the code COACHDOCTOR, all one word and lowercase, for a special 20% discount. For schools and clubs, you can also get journals specific to your group's needs, with schools or clubs' logos, team values, and many other options to make it specific to you. Okay, now on to the episode. In this episode, I speak with Grant Doorey. Grant is a career coach who has spent over 25 years in professional coaching and coached at 4 Rugby World Cups, the French Top 14, the English Premiership, and Super Rugby, to name a few. Grant discusses his journey and some of the learnings along the way. We discuss coaching across 3 different continents and cultures, language barriers, and the sacrifices that elite coaching involves. There is a lot for aspiring coaches to learn from this conversation. All right, Grant, thanks so much for joining us on the Coach Doctor podcast today, mate. First of all, could you give me a quick introduction into who you are and what you're doing?
Cool, mate. Welcome. Thanks, James. Appreciate the opportunity, mate, to come and share a bit of time with you. Mate, I'm what I call a career coach. So my background's in teaching. I probably had my first coaching responsibility when I was about 16 years old. Coaching at my high school in North Sydney, mate, Morris College, North Shore, when I helped coach one of the younger rugby league teams when I was one of the seniors there. So I've been coaching for a long time, mate. As I said, background in teaching, phys ed teaching. So as you know, mate, through ACPE, was fortunate enough to get good grounding in pedagogy and coach education. So fortunate enough to sort of do probably about 15 different coaching courses in different sports. So a real diverse experience. And then, mate, my journey sort of led me to playing and coaching at a bit of rugby league and, then into rugby union. So that's sort of how I describe myself in a nutshell, bit of a career coach.
I had a chat with someone the other day about that. Back in the day, we used to have to do those, I think it was 14 or 15 level 1 coaching courses to graduate. And I think that was good, mate. We got quite a diverse range of experience in coaching in terms of, not just coaching the sports we're ultra familiar with, but, coaching, level 1 golf and level 1 AFL and level 1 basketball and water polo, a whole heap of things. So I really enjoyed that aspect of it because you got to sort of learn from a whole different sports and how they sort of do things. So you start off as a PE teacher, as you sort of identified then. There's a whole heap of coaches with teaching backgrounds. How did you find this assisted your coaching development?
Well, I just like we just alluded to, it's that sort of grounding in, skill acquisition, skill development, pedagogy, that sort of is a reasonable foundation to set you up to be a successful coach. And then obviously the practical elements of it, learning how to coach a variety of different sports in a variety of different ways is a good way to practically implement your coaching philosophies without too much pressure, because obviously when you're in a school environment, you're not trying to coach the next professional player, so there's not too much pressure in terms of that. So you can explore a little bit, and you can go on a bit of a discovery tour in terms of where your coaching's get ahead, and can you just learn and master your craft on the way. So that's how I found it, mate. Just in terms of it was just a great foundation for me in learning the craft of coaching.
So, looking at your coaching pathway and this would be really, I think, interesting for development coaches who want to end up coaching at that international level like you've done. You were teaching in Sydney, and then you ended up taking a player coaching role over in, was it the UK?
Yeah, so I was coaching. I was actually assistant sports master and director of rugby at Skeggs Redlands in Neutral Bay, which is a co-ed private school. Had a very small rugby program at that time, but a very passionate rugby program. So I was encouraged by senior teachers there, Martin Longhurst, the sports master, to do my coaching accreditation. So I did my level 1, my level 2, and started my level 3 when I was there. So that gives you a good grounding in the first instance. And then I had some experience coaching the first 15 and coaching the independent school, second 15. So I got exposure to good coaches and guys like Joe Barakat, who was coaching the first team for that representative sort of competition. He was coaching the first, so just rubbing shoulders with those sorts of guys and talking to people with way more rugby experience than I had. And then I just went overseas, mate, as a young player. I was still trying to play then, and end up having 3 years in the north of England. Then I headed to France, and that's where I got my first coaching opportunity. So I was a player coach at a rugby league club called Villeneuve-sur-Lot in the southwest of France, and fortunate enough to have a very good team, and we had some success. And sometimes with success, opportunities come after that.
So you went to England first as a player coach, and then you, as you said, went over to France. How did you manage that change in culture going from the UK to France, and the language? Were you able to speak French? How did you cope in that scenario?
Yeah, I couldn't speak French, first of all. I mean, I'd love to say, James, I had a really clear strategic plan to all of this, but mate, it was all fly by the seat of your pants stuff. I was a young man. I was single, and then I met my now wife in Greece. She moved up to the north of England, and we just thought, what about a bit of a sea change? We'll try France. She could speak a bit of French, and I learned French on the go, mate. So to be honest, I was all about full immersion back in those days. We had a number of Aussies and Kiwis playing there, and just jumped in at the deep end and had a crack, and it ended up, over time being the right decision. But it was about full immersion into the culture and learning on the run, really.
And how about being a player coach? Did you find being a player coach helped you grow as a coach?
Well, anyone who's been a player coach knows that you're only part of a very small world. So if you're a player coach, it probably means you've only got one other person with you helping you out. So I had a guy called Jean-Luc Albert, who was my assistant coach. He was a teacher as well, phys ed teacher, very similar background to my own. So we were aligned on a lot of the approach and the way we wanted to coach. The guy who coached before me was an English guy. He had a very different approach to me. It was much more dictatorial. My way was much more guided discovery. It was about developing and getting the best out of some young players, and at the same time having some really good senior players who could, teach and grow those young players at the same time. So, mate, it was really about just working out, what I had to do, or what I had to tweak in terms of creating those opportunities to get the best out of an already very good team who were almost good enough to win, or to be very successful. But we just had to tweak a few things, and we tweaked a few things, and we ended up winning 3 or 4 premierships in a row and 3 or 4 cups in a row, and we ended up winning a European Cup. So it was a really good part of the journey, mate. So sometimes when you're successful early, it takes a bit of pressure off you.
Yeah, no, for sure. And in terms of the French coaching culture or the French coaching style, if you could say there is one,
Yeah.
did you find being in that environment added anything to your coaching that you might not have picked up had you been only coaching in Australia or the UK?
Yeah, I'll talk about the rugby league side of it first, and then I'll go on to the rugby union side of it. So the rugby league side of it was probably they were probably high on passion, low on technical capability, or low on technical understanding. So we had guys like Paul Sirinen who came and played at the club that I was at. We had guys like Stephen Plath who had played, a significant amounts of footy here in Brisbane. So we had good senior players, Vince Wolf, a number of internationals, and then 7 or 8 French internationals. So we had a very good team. So it was really about taking their technical development to the next level and then really focusing on making sure that we were giving them the right tools to physically get the best out of them, because they hadn't been in what I call semi-professional programs, really. They'd been very much part-time. So just shifting that mentality to a sort of part-time, sort of full-time professional mindset. And we managed to do that pretty quickly, and they were really keen to grow and learn their skills. So we really got a significant uplift, mate, over the first year, and then that led us that first year where we won the triple, the French Cup, the French Championship, and the European Cup in the first year. It sort of laid the foundation for 3 or 4 years of success then. And the big difference was, mate, I'd summarise it as they were high on passion. I was high on skill development and responsibility. So it blended nicely.
So the next step in your journey was a return to rugby union as an assistant coach in the top 14. So how did this come about after being involved in rugby league for quite a while?
Mate, there were some guys in Europe, particularly at that time, who were carving a bit of a path for rugby league coaches. Guys like Phil Larder, John Muggleton, Dave Ellis, who was working with France, Phil Larder, who was working with England, and both those guys had coached me recently. So it basically came about, mate, is that they had a conversation with Philippe Saint-André and Laurent Seigneur, who are 2 very well-respected ex-international French players who'd been coaching in Gloucester, and they knew that they wanted a Anglo-Saxon defence coach because they thought that they needed to just switch up the mentality around their defensive side of the game. So they basically reached out to me and had a conversation. I packed up my whole family, my small family at that stage, my wife and my son Mac, into a truck, basically turned up to Bourgogne, which was about 5 hours drive from where I was in the south west of France, and said either I unpack this truck here today or I unpack it in England tomorrow. It's really up to you, but I need a contract offer in the next 24 hours. So mate, they came and watched me coach a couple of times in Villeneuve. Then we had a couple of conversations, and it turned into an opportunity for a year that got me in the door. And nice. that was at Bourgogne, CSBG Rugby in the top 14. They were a reasonably competitive team, and we ended up being a European Cup team for 4 or 5 years in a row after that. I was only there for 1 year, but then I went back after that.
Yeah, brilliant. So up until this stage, you've had a bit of a dream run of things, and things just keep developing for you. And then you get a call from John Kirwan. Tell me about this phone call.
Yeah, mate, it was about 3/4 of the way through my first season of coaching rugby union. And it was March, because I remember it was March because the Six Nations had just finished at the end of February. And John Kirwan, who was then the assistant coach of Italy under Brad Johnson, had just become the head coach of Italy. And he had a chat to Phil Larder. Phil Larder was the England coach. He said, Phil, I need you to come and help Italy. Phil said, I can't do that. I'm tied up to the Rugby World Cup in Australia, after 2003. But this guy's going well in France. He's an Australian guy. Give him a call. He might be able to help you. So JK reached out to me, said, Grant, I've heard a couple of good things about you. I know you're doing some good work in the top 14. Would you like to go and coach the World Cup in Australia in 2003? And he said, I'll send a ticket for you to come and visit us in Rome whenever you get some time off. So literally 5 days later, I was in Rome meeting him, John Kerwin, ex All Black, great All Black, and mental health advocate, and his manager Luca Lucy, who was an Aussie Italian guy, and basically we just struck up a relationship from there and created an opportunity for me to go to Italy. So we packed up the family at the end of that first year in Bourgogne and headed off to Italy for 3 years.
Yeah, amazing. What was it like when you answered the phone and John Kerwin's asking you to go over and see things in Italy? What was?
Yeah, it was a bit surreal, to be honest. I had an agent at the time, Dick Best, who was the ex-England coach. He basically said, "Look, Grant, John Kerwin's going to give you a call. Just play it pretty cool. But I don't know, any young coach, you can sometimes get your mind can get clouded by excitement sometimes. So I'm not sure how it went. I sort of got this vision of how it went in my head, but maybe it wasn't like that. Potentially, I was a bit overexcited, but I was just really excited, mate, because it was a home World Cup in Australia. 2003. My dad was still around. I thought it was an opportunity to also make him proud and go and coach back in Australia at a Rugby World Cup with an emerging nation, because Italy were an emerging nation then. And JK really gave me a license to, and Phil Larder encouraged me to make sure you get the license to spend a lot of time on the defense, because unless you do, you're not going to be successful there. So I really fought hard on getting in enough time to get my fundamentals right and embedding the fundamentals and doing a lot of work on their tackle technique. And, we had a couple of good wins in that Rugby World Cup. We, beat Tonga really well, 35-12, and beat Canada, and, reasonably close to shaking up Wales. I mean, we lost sort of 28-15 or something like that in the end, but it's a really positive experience for me, mate, going to coach with Italy and, really successful sort of time in terms of them growing and emerging into the rugby nation they are now.
So what was the most noticeable difference between coaching club rugby and then working with the Italian national team?
Just time, mate. I mean, when I was at Bourgogne, I had 30 weeks a year to work intentionally and deliberately upskilling or changing the skill habits of the players, where in an international setup, you've got blocks of time, and not so much in the first year, because when you get a World Cup year, you're very fortunate. You get a lot of time in a World Cup year, but otherwise, if it's not a World Cup year, you don't get the time. So it's really that intentional time to build your skills and develop their skill capability, mate, over time, change their mindsets and their skill sets. That's the biggest difference. And get to know them, get to know the players really well, their habits, and it takes time to break down their habits. So just getting to know them well enough to be able to help them, I think, is the biggest challenge.
In a scenario like that, where you've got a national team and you're going to a tournament like the World Cup, how much emphasis, and it might change depending on who the coach is, but how much emphasis did John Kerwin and yourself and the coaching staff put into developing like a culture and a team, away from not so much the rugby specific stuff, but more the camaraderie and the culture within the group?
Yeah, mate. I mean, it's much more important than the technical, tactical stuff, to be honest. And it's one of John's strengths. And he fully immersed himself in that culture anyway. He's married to an Italian girl, Fiorella. He's got 3 Italian kids. He lived in Treviso for 15 years and still got a house there. So he was fully immersed into the Italian culture anyway. I'll give you an example of what full immersion looks like. So for me, it was about arriving, and then the next day I had to coach my first session with the national team. And JK basically said to me, "Look, mate, I don't care what you do, but here we don't coach in English. We coach in Italian." So my first day, I literally had to learn 6 or 7 action words that could get me through a coaching session in Italian, and it just built from there. So what it meant is that the players were deeply respectful of me, because they knew that I was all in on the journey with them. And it allows you to build stronger relationships. It allows your connections to be more authentic, and you just got to invest time and energy in understanding the culture. And we just made sure it was one of the things we did intentionally and deliberately, mate. And, we got some help from a mental skills coach who was very good and understanding the Italian way and what they aspired to be, because, for a long time, the Italians were the laughing stock of, the Six Nations rugby. And I think during that time, we sort of changed the mentality a little bit. We were significantly more competitive. We had a good young batch of players that sort of became the foundation of that team for the next 10 to 15 years. So it was really about just all in, mate, on the culture, understanding it, in the first instance, and then contributing to it by little things like understanding the language.
So could you speak Italian now?
Yeah, I can speak Italian now, yeah.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah.
So Italian
and French. So I can speak those two languages pretty well.
Oh, great. Good job.
Yeah.
So a couple of years later, you joined another emerging nation in rugby, taking up a role with the Japanese team. You travel to the World Cup again, a new language, another very different culture. Did you have to adapt or change your coaching in any way, or what had worked in the past was what you were doing again? How did that work?
Yeah, I think you've always got to change your approach because no team's the same. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I think what people have got to understand is when JK and I were with these teams, when we first went to Italy, they were ranked 19 in the world. So they were nowhere near the top 10. And the same with Japan. I think when I first arrived in Japan, they were 20th in the world. And JK sent me 4 games from that year's P&C. And he said, Grant, have a look at this, see if you reckon we can help these guys. Because he'd been offered the head coach role as on an interim basis through Ota Osamu, who is one of his old mates at NEC. He had a long-standing relationship with him. He was at the JRFU. So, and I watched 4 games of their footy when they got beaten by between 45 and 55 points in the P&C that year, and I just saw nothing but upside. Because I just saw a speed and intensity and intent to the way they wanted to do things, or the way they were trying to do things, but just no technical capability really. It was just was very, what I'd call very, very loose. They didn't have any structure. They had no defensive structure. They had no real focus on the individual contact. So I just saw nothing but upside. So, yeah, I had to completely change my approach. But it was about really looking at what things Japan already did well that we could just harness and try to turn it into some positives. I think that's the challenge for all coaches, isn't it? To try and blend the things that you're trying to do with the things that you're trying to do well, and profile your team effectively to make sure you're bringing out some of those strengths in the way you're trying to play the game versus just trying to play the game you think might work.
So at that stage, you'd been to a World Cup with Italy, and then you go to a World Cup with Japan.
Yeah.
I mean, for most coaches, attending or going to a World Cup would be an amazing experience and a bit of a dream come true. Yeah. What did it mean to you going to World Cups?
Yeah, I mean, it's I suppose it's the biggest stage with the best players in the best stadiums. And it's absolutely breathtaking, mate. So it's really, I sort of never thought about it in terms of what my personal aspirations were. It was all about helping those players perform on the biggest stage against the best players in the world. And we got a couple of hidings. I remember getting beaten by Australia by, I think it was 90 points in Lyon, because that wasn't our priority game. Because when you're a tier 2 or tier 3 nation, you've got to target your games reasonably effectively. Because in those days, our World Cups were over in 18 days. We had literally 4 games in 18 days in Australia and in France. So you couldn't target all of them. So, we got really close against Fiji, and Japan had sort of been hunting this elusive Rugby World Cup win for a long time. We managed to have 2 draws in the time that I was there, and both times one time we stole victory from the jaws of defeat, and the other time we stole defeat from the jaws of victory almost. So we should have won one, and Canada probably should have won the other, but we didn't get that elusive win from them. We got a couple of draws, but it really felt like we took that team from 20 in the world to 11 in the world. We won a PNC, and I think we set a bit of that pathway for what the great job after that Eddie Jones and Jamie Joseph have done to springboard that team to the next level.
Yeah, I was going to say that. I mean, we tend to judge these coaching experiences through World Cups, but like you said, you'd taken a team that was ranked 20th in the world, that was getting beaten by 40, 50 points in the Pacific Nations Cup to, winning Pacific Nations Cup and being successful against Fiji and Samoa and Tonga. So that would have been a great result for you guys in terms of measuring your success.
Yeah, and I mean, ultimately, mate, what we would have liked to do, we would have liked to win more Rugby World Cup games, or we would have liked to win at least one, but that didn't happen. But I think, sometimes you measure success potentially in the wrong way. It's not all about wins and losses. A lot of it when you're coaching in tier 2, tier 3 countries, and I say tier 3 with utmost respect because I think some of those tier 2, tier 3 countries, there's a real grey area about how competitive that sort of 10 to sort of 24 in the world is. I think it's really competitive now, particularly with the emergence of teams like Spain and Portugal and Romania, teams like that. So really, mate, it's about, it was about progress. It was a period of 4 years of progress.
Do you have a soft spot for Italy and Japan now when you watch them playing international rugby?
Absolutely, yeah. I always want them to do well. And I mean, a lot of the guys who, particularly in Italy, it's a small rugby nation with not too many players. So some of the guys like Marco Bortolami, who is a great player for us and great captain for us, is now coaching Benetton. So still in touch with guys like that. And, some of the guys who are playing in Japan are now in the union and still heavily involved in that nation or the emergence or the rise of that nation. So, mate, absolutely. If Australia aren't playing, I want them to do well.
Yeah, no, that's great. So your time at Japan comes to an end after the 2011 World Cup in New Zealand, and you get a tap on the shoulder about an opportunity to join Super Rugby with the Auckland Blues, or the Blues as they're known. How did that super environment compared to those national teams and other coaching roles you'd been involved with?
Yeah, I think maybe a missing piece of the puzzle there in 2006. After my first couple of years in Italy, John got sacked in Italy, and I went back to France and coached in the top 14 for 2 seasons under Christophe Urios. So I think one of the things that I know that is that you learn a lot of stuff off all the people you work with. So whether you're working with assistant coaches like Tim Lane, spent a bit of time with us in Italy, and Glenn Ellis spent a bit of time with us in Italy, and guys like Francis Letter and Philippe Saint-Andre when I was in France. You learn so much off so many of these guys, particularly when I was in my formational years as a coach in rugby. I was still learning stuff. So my whole philosophy was that I was always still learning. But when I got the sort of tap on the shoulder to get an opportunity in New Zealand, I thought, wow, that's the mecca of rugby. I never expected or envisaged as a sort of cast-off rugby league player in Australia that would be potentially going to coach one of the biggest franchises in the world in the Auckland Blues. So that opportunity, I was there for 3 years. It was a tough gig. It was a team that was trying to turn around and get back to its past greatness. But really, it was just an opportunity. It was too good to turn down. And I was fully committed to going there with Graham Henry, Mick Byrne, and John to try and turn that place around. And that's what we worked hard to do over the 3 years. We didn't quite manage it, but once again, it was part of my journey. It
was a pretty sweet time to be involved in New Zealand rugby because the All Blacks had just won the World Cup at home in New Zealand, and I'm assuming you were coaching some World Cup winning All Blacks. Perry Wipu might have been one of those players. Was it daunting as a coach to work with such elite players? Did you find that some of these guys were, the elite of the elite, was it a daunting experience in terms of thinking, oh, I've got to make sure I say the right thing or do the right thing or coach the right way with such brilliant players?
Yeah, looking back on it, I was probably highly conscious of that. But if I look back on it from a learning point of view, I wish I was more curious. Instead of trying to have all the answers, those guys respond well when you bring the best out of them. So I think I could have done more of that. I could have leveraged off the knowledge of Perry, could have leveraged off the knowledge of Marlon, and could have leveraged off the young vibrancy of Charles Piatow and guys like that to really help me get the best out of those players, because I'd never really coached a lot of Polynesian players before. And what I know about coaching Polynesian players now, it's all about connection. It's all about having the right relationships. It's about building strong relationships that are got the foundation of trust, and you can go to them and have open, robust relationships. At the end of the day, still have a laugh and be on the same page. So I would have potentially changed my approach a little bit, looking back on it.
So going back to that, looking back at, I guess, all your coaching experiences, what was some of the greatest things you learned? And you just probably mentioned one in terms of building relationships, especially with that Polynesian group of players. What were some other things that you found you really, really learnt and would do differently now?
Well, I think I did some of my best coaching sort of recently, even with Tonga. And you're always growing and learning, James. That's the thing. I was always really curious about growing and learning and continuing to develop. So I was always off, watching other coaches and watching other sports. So that's one thing. Just be curious about your own learning and work out what you need to get better at. And be really intentional about that. The other thing is, we expect players to be really curious and take sort of ownership of their own learning. You've also got to do that as a coach and be willing that sometimes you're vulnerable and you don't have to have all the answers. So the best I've coached ever probably is when I was just challenging the curiosity of my players and the engagement of my players to be really conscious and deliberate about what they were bringing to the table to help the team prepare, train well, and perform well. And that's about, continuous improvement loops and feedback cycles and, asking the right questions. So just that craft of coaching, mate, asking the right questions, knowing when to leave it to them, for them to problem solve or for them to collaborate and problem solve themselves. So being able to tweak the balance or get the balance right, or tweak that sort of balance of the right information without too much, and letting them guide and discover it for themselves as well. So they're probably some of the key things.
You mentioned earlier on when you were in France that you actually utilised a bit of a guided discovery approach as a coach, and that was probably quite ahead of your time, because back then, I'd say that there would be a lot of command style of coaching and that authoritative sort of approach.
Yeah.
What sort of led you to become more of a guided discovery style of coach that early on?
Well, what I learned, and one of the guys who taught me a lot about this, was a guy called Francis Letta. He was an old guy. He was about 55, 60. So it's not that old now when I think about how old I am, but he was about 55, 60. He was assistant coach at Bourgogne. He was a really hands-on relationship pedagogy type coach who was really clued into his learning cycles and his technical development. So he was really ahead of his time, and I learnt through him. So I came in basically as a rugby league player, and what I didn't know what I didn't know. So I recognised that I had a whole lot to learn. I had a lot of smart players. So I realised, okay, so the knowledge is not mine. I've got a lot of smart players. So what do I need to do to get more knowledge? Well, I need to be good at asking questions. So guys like Julien Bonner and, great French, loose forward, who I actually coached against in the 2019 Rugby World Cup. And we enjoyed a beer in the change room, when France beat us 23-21 in Osaka. just leveraging off the knowledge that was already in the room and just not having all the answers and just saying, can you, tell me what you know about this? Guys like Olivier Miloud, who was a great French prop, and Sebastian Chabal, who was a great technician. Just learning from the players I had and just showing some vulnerability. I found worked really well for me.
Yeah, no, that's some great advice. I think being able to be vulnerable as a coach is a really important aspect of coaching. So you finish up with the Auckland Blues, and a few years later you return to the international scene, as you mentioned, with Tonga, and you go to the 2019 World Cup in Japan. You're in a pool with England, who are probably the most resourced rugby nation in the world. You've got France, who are developing into a top four contender. You've got Argentina, who finished in the top four at the previous World Cup. And realistically, as a tier 2 nation, how do you approach the games against some of those, I guess, massive tier 1 nations that have had so much success in the past?
Yeah, great question. I went on a bit of a journey with Kef and Tonga, and my philosophy changed when I got there a little bit, because in 2016 I left the Auckland Blues and went to London Irish, and I got sacked after a year. And a lot of coaches have been sacked. Most coaches have probably been sacked at some stage in their career, particularly if you've been coaching for more than 20 years. But what I learned is that I had to step back and realise that I'd made some mistakes. And so what was I going to do differently? I was either going to coach differently or behave differently, or just keep going ahead on the same path and potentially not end all that well and end in tears again. So I changed my approach a little bit, became probably more player centered. I always thought that I was a player centered coach, but I think sometimes we convince ourselves that we're doing something better than we think we're doing, and we got some things wrong there around the culture and the identity of the club that we didn't understand well enough, and the identity of the league. So you really got to understand what you're getting yourself into, I think, is a word of advice before you go anywhere new. So I sort of came to the Tonga opportunity with a fresh approach. So I didn't really come in thinking that I had to be the subject matter expert. I wanted to leverage off we had some good leaders in that crew, with guys like Toulouse Savanu, who didn't play all that much for Tonga in that time, but it was a very good leader. Guys like Siale Pieta, who was a great captain for the Kalitahi for so long, and some other good senior leaders, smart rugby players, mate. And I really just embedded myself in the culture. So the culture was about family, faith, and fun, and their whole goal was to have fun, make Tonga proud, and play the best footy they could at the same time. So I really simplified things for myself, and I was only doing it for 8 weeks a year. So it wasn't a full-time coaching role, but I certainly gave it more than 8 weeks a year. But trying to have maximize your impact in that environment was all about being reasonably well planned, leaning on your best players, and just consistently trying to challenge them to get better. And that's what I thought we did pretty well. And we were very competitive at that Rugby World Cup. I mean, lost to France 23-21. I think we lost to Argentina 28-14, but we were down 28-0 after sort of 15 minutes. So really competitive, and England beat us 35-3 or 35-6. So competing for a long periods of time, and then we beat USA pretty well after scoring a couple of late tries. But once again, it was about the helping the players get ready to perform on the biggest stage they're ever going to be at. So they could set, for them, it's long-term financial success or financial security for their families. If they go well at a Rugby World Cup, they get a 3 or 4 year opportunity to sign with a club. So it can change their lives. So I really simplified it for myself, and thought that I was just there to serve the players well as much as I could. So that's what I tried to do, and help Kev succeed if I was doing a reasonably good job.
And again, with the culture, you'd spent some time working with Pacifica players at the Auckland Blues.
Yeah.
Did that help you immerse yourself in the culture with Tonga?
Yep, it did. And I think that we can complicate culture and hide behind culture a lot, but ultimately, whatever culture you're coaching in, it's about the relationships you've got. So I had some good relationships, and I had some relationships that were stressful. And you're always going to have that in a good environment, because some people challenge you more than others. And I appreciated those people who challenged me when they challenged me in the right ways. And my job as a coach is to challenge and help those players to grow. And I think, when they look back at it, they probably appreciated that as well. So, man, it's all about relationships, and culture is just what emerges out of those relationships, really. I'm pretty proud of what I managed to achieve with Tonga over that sort of 4 or 5 year period.
When you start working with a team like Tonga or Japan, and like we talked about, you're playing some pretty highly resourced teams that are very successful.
Yeah.
What's the mindset in terms of, when you go to play England as Tonga, do you go into the game challenging the players to try and win the game, or is it about performing your role the best of your ability, or is it about, let's keep respect on the scoreboard? We know we're going to lose, so let's just try and make it respectful. How do you go into those games or prepare the players?
Yeah, that mindset question is a really good one. I think Tonga is an extremely proud nation. So we never spoke about just competing. We always spoke about competing well enough to win, because I know that rugby's a funny game, and that excellent teams have lost to good teams, and it happens. Surprises happen. So we're always just focusing on doing our own stuff well, without overthinking what the opposition could bring, but recognizing that we had to play the game that was more like the one that we were trying to sort of shape, versus the game that they were trying to shape. Because if they played a game high tempo, fast pace, we'd be in all sorts of trouble after 15 minutes. So we know what the profile of game that suits us. So we just try to really even it out by playing the style of game that's going to suit us. And once again, that's about you as a coach looking at your strengths, trying to bring those strengths to light, and trying to accentuate ways that you can minimize the strengths of the opposition. And there's always ways you can do that. You just got to get creative about the way you can do it sometimes. But we always had high levels of belief, and that we thought that we could beat one of those big three teams. We thought we'd win one of those games against England, France, or Argentina. And there's a great example in 2011. Tonga beat France. And then and France played in a World Cup final. So that gave us a level of belief.
Yeah. I remember watching that game. I remember sitting at home watching Tonga beat France and thinking, "Wow, that's a great result! Great result."
Yeah, and then unfortunately, 10 days later, they lost to Canada.
Yeah,
they could have easily been in the semi-finals.
Yeah. So, in that sense, what do teams like Italy, Japan, and Tonga need to do to become more consistent in terms of success on the field? Is there anything that you'd change that would drastically improve those teams?
With Italy and Japan, it's different because they had full-time coaching staffs. Okay, so I think Italy and Japan are on the right track. And they have been since I was there. We were full-time coaches. We were in a full-time program. We had full-time support. We were well funded. That's not the case with Tonga. So Totai Kefu is one of the only full-time members of staff. We've got an analyst, one strength and conditioning coach. Kef is the only coach, and a CEO. And I'm not involved with Tonga anymore, but I think that if World Rugby are going to be serious about those tier 2, tier 3 nations competing, they need to provide them with enough support so at least their national teams can have year-round support of their playing group. because then you can make, really conscious and deliberate decisions around selection, around physical preparation, around monitoring performance, monitoring form. But then it allows you to choose the right players in form at the right time. Kev can't do any of that stuff with Tonga at the moment. He just hasn't got the resources to do it.
Mm.
So some of it's resource.
And Tonga, you've got players all over the world, really, don't you? They're playing in England, they're France, they're in New Zealand and Australia.
Yeah, I would suggest that one of the solutions for Tonga is to probably have two or three full-time staff in Europe and 2 or 3 full-time staff in Australia, New Zealand and the islands. And, as well as what's happening on the island, because, ultimately a lot of very good young Tongan rugby players at the moment are seeing their future with Japan or New Zealand before they're seeing their future with the Ikalitahi. And that means that sometimes we're getting the second or third best players because we're losing 20 or 30 players a year out of high school to Japanese high schools or universities. So that's just too much. If you took the top 20 players out of New Zealand every year, in 5 years' time, they wouldn't be very strong. So that's been happening in Tonga for the last 10 years.
Yeah.
So that's massively damaging to the future opportunities of the Ikalitahi.
Is that just come back to funding and the opportunities for players back on the island, or?
Yeah. I mean, they're life-changing opportunities, James, for somebody who can go, a 16-year-old Tongan schoolboy who gets a scholarship to go to Nihon University or Tokai University, full-time. And then if he goes okay, he's going to get a full-time professional rugby contract in one of the top league teams as well. So it's life-changing, and I get that. So I don't want to underestimate the human impact of it. But the rugby impact on the Ikalitahi is that we're losing 15 or 20 of our best players every year to other nations.
Yeah, and that's huge, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it's untenable in terms of long-term success for Tonga.
Grant, I'm going to take you back to France. You're a player coach in a rugby league team.
Yeah.
Did you ever think, looking ahead, you'd have coached rugby union at, was it 3 or 4 World Cups?
4 World Cups. Yeah.
4 World Cups. Did you ever think that would be the case?
No, mate. As I said to you early on, James, I didn't have a grand plan, and I was very fortunate that my wife Claire and my 2 sons Mac and Monty had been on this journey with me. Mac was born in France, Monty was born in Italy. I met my wife in Greece. We've lived in Australia, New Zealand, England. We've been to Japan together. We've been to Tonga together. So we've travelled the world on this journey. Mate, I had no idea. But all I've tried to do along the journey is maximise my short-term opportunity. So I reckon the key to long-term success is nailing your short-term goals. Mm-hmm. So if I do really well today, tomorrow's going to look after itself. So I didn't really think too far ahead. I never have. So I'm sort of living by that philosophy now. If I, do really well now, tomorrow will look after itself. So I'm just, I'll keep having that short-term philosophy, mate.
Yeah. So if you go for a job interview and they say, "What's your 5-year plan?" It's don't worry about 5 years' time. I'm going to nail tomorrow. That's going to be my important, that's my number one priority right now.
Yeah. I mean, anyone who asks you for a 5-year plan as a coach knows that they're going to sack you after a year if you don't get it right. Mm. So I actually think it's a bit disingenuous to be asking somebody for their 5-year plan. Potentially a better thing would be asking you, well, what's your critical plan for establishing a relationship so they can set you up for some longer term success? Mm-hmm. Or how are you going to set this team, franchise, organization up for long term success by creating some sustainable systems, processes, and relationships, and getting the right people on board with you that can make the changes necessary to shift the dial. Because pretty much every organization you go to as a new coach, you're there for a reason. They either don't like the coach that's been there before, or they're not happy with the results. So there's always an opportunity to make sure you know how you're being measured. Because I've made the mistake a couple of times of not really being sure how I was measured, and potentially getting blindsided because of it.
Yeah. Okay. So, mate, as an up and coming coach, and a lot of people who want to coach at that international level and do a lot of the things that you've done, it's a very glorious sort of dream to have. Travel the world, being a professional coach. Yeah. But obviously, there's a lot of hardships in that as well. So what would be some of the hardest things about being a career coach over those years from, I guess 1994 to 2022?
Yeah, well, when I look back at it, James, I look back at pivotal moments. So pivotal moments, I left a very good rugby league club in Keighley in West Yorkshire, where we had 3 or 4 years of a lot of success as a player. But I took a risk. I took a risk to go to France and try something different. So, work out in your own mind what risk and reward you're comfortable with, and have a real plan in terms of what your family are comfortable with as well, because it impacts more than just you. And it's got to be a broader plan to include those people around you that you care about, because you've got to make it work as a family. Or we definitely have to make it work as a family. But yeah, taking a couple of risks, I'd say, is key. And then just really working hard to, once you take the risk, maximize your opportunity to nail it by being proactive about your own learning, owning your own journey, because what I've learned is that no one cares about your success more than you do. So if you don't own it, no one's going to own it for you. So be proactive, get your coaching tickets, get yourself in the shop window, have the right conversations with the right people. You can never network enough. You can never share enough. You can never have enough conversations. You can never have a strong enough coaching community of relationships. Just get yourself out there and take some risks and make it happen for yourself. Yeah,
some great advice. And in terms of some of those difficulties, you talked about moving around with family.
Yeah.
Are those things hard, and knowing that you've got a job for a set amount of time, and if you don't perform, this might impact your family. You might have to get up and move again, or the financial burden might be around the corner if the team doesn't perform. How does that affect your mindset when you are coaching?
Never affected my mindset at all. So I never thought about worst case scenario. I never thought about what happens if this happens. I was never a what if person. I was more of a, what can I do to make this work? Looking for the positives. I always arrived and looking through rose-colored glasses. So I was always looking for ways that it would work versus ways that it might not work.
Okay.
So that positive mindset and that outlook of positivity really served me well for a long time, and it still does. It's about building relationships, creating memories with people you care about. Doing some cool stuff. I've done for 25 years. I've done a lot of cool stuff with a lot of cool people, and made some great memories, and taken my family on a terrific journey. And I wouldn't be the person I am now with the relationships with my family, because what you do know as a family is that everywhere we went, we knew we were in it together, and we could count on each other. So it didn't matter what was happening peripherally. We knew we could count on each other, and that we were basically we could only count on each other. So the rest of the stuff, mate, we just rolled with the punches.
Yeah, nice. I think that's another really good point. To stay focused on positives. Yeah. Think about how you're going to make it work rather than what if it doesn't work. Because a lot of people have that mindset that what if it doesn't work, and you're constantly trying to plug holes and trying to make sure that you're not getting sacked, rather than thinking about how you're going to make it work and how you're going to be successful in the role that you're in. So yeah, some great advice there, Grant. So
yeah, I'll give you an example, mate. 2016, 6 games out from the end of the English premiership, I told our director of rugby at at London Irish that he should sack one of the coaches. And I was one of the coaches. He said, if I was you guys, I would be sacking one of the coaches to try and stimulate a response out of this group. They didn't do it. So I was never worried about my own job. It was never about me.
Yeah.
And just be careful. I would say to any aspirational coaches, just do your homework, do your due diligence in terms of what you're getting yourself into, because so many young coaches, they get blindsided by this glossy professional rugby picture that they have in their mind about full-time rugby environments. It is hard work. You know, I remember when I was coaching in France, mate, I was, 14, 15-hour days. So to do anything well, you got to work bloody hard at it. So, and the grass is not always greener on the other side. Yeah. So just make sure you know what you're getting yourself in for, and know what you're willing to do to get it. So a lot of young coaches want to become professional coaches. Well, I ask them, well, okay, so you're on $100,000 a year now as a XYZ. So what are you willing to do to become a professional rugby coach? Yeah. Because what I know is that the chances are you probably won't get the first step on the ladder at $100K a year. So what are you willing to do it?
And that's a really good question. I remember driving to the airport with you in your Jeep, and you asked me that exact question. What are you willing to do? Because, like you said, if you're in a good role, or you've got a pretty good job, and, to take that step, or to make that step into professional sport, you might have to take a massive pay cut and really, evaluate what, like you talked about in terms of risk versus reward. Are you willing to take these risks, make less money, but work really hard at it, and develop yourself and create opportunities through taking some of those risks? So it's a really good, and I think it's really important for coaches to think about that. Like, if they want to go into that professional environment, that there are things like that to consider.
Absolutely, yeah, and don't be. And I'm not trying to scare people off risk, because I built my whole career on taking risks that potentially other people would be uncomfortable with. But just recognise your own comfort level with it, and then work out what you're willing to do for it. Because I talk to a lot of people who tell me they want to be professional rugby coaches, and when I dig a little bit deeper, they're not really quite sure about what they're willing to do it.
Yeah. Before we go, Grant, what's next for you, mate? What's next in terms of the future, in terms of your coaching opportunities? Are you going to go back into professional coaching? I know you're working more in the corporate world at the moment, and doing some stuff on the side with, I think, IRANS or IRA as well. So what's in the future for you?
So, mate, I'm keeping the rugby door open with a couple of what I call passion projects. And what I say by passion projects is, you don't get paid a lot to do them, but they tick the box in terms of keeping me involved in the game, keeping me, front and center about thinking about the game, coaching the game, mentoring other coaches. So I've got a couple of projects that are doing that for me, or 3 little rugby projects at the moment. One's with Rugby Australia, doing some coach development mentoring through Michael Magripoulos and IRA. So we're doing some stuff there, and that's around level 3, level 4 coaching courses, and doing some work up here with Queensland Rugby Union as well to help sort of mentor some coaches. So I'm doing that, doing a bit of work with IRA, which gets me, on the grass coaching, facilitating a couple of courses, which is great every year. That's with Sean Hedger and Andrew Fraser and Duncan McDonald. So they're good guys. I get to work with Kev a little bit doing that, and other good coaches. So that's good. And I'm doing some mentoring of Steve Brett, Blake Bradford, and some other young coaches at Rugby Atlanta and the MLR. So I've got 3 little rugby projects, mate, that's keeping me busy, at the same time as doing about 50 or 60 hours a week in the corporate world, supporting, leaders in around high performance coaching and high performing teams, culture, and basically just embracing that whole continuous improvement mindset, supporting sort of corporate leaders of the future, being more purpose driven and more authentic. So, got plenty of work on at the moment, mate. So I'm pretty busy and doing a bit of study at the same time.
Oh, nice. What are you studying?
Well, I was studying a graduate certificate in leadership, which I've almost finished at the end of my second paper, and just got a couple of credentials to finish off before I decide whether I embark on my master's, which is the plan. So next year I hope to do my master's through Deakin University.
Oh, nice, mate. Nice. Yeah, I guess that's one of the things. A lot of the coaches I talk to are really big into continuing learning and lifelong learning and developing, through masters and through other, graduate courses.
Yeah.
And I guess they never see an end to that learning experience, and that's, I think, a really admirable quality for coaches to have.
Yeah, I mean, I'm 54, mate. It'd be easy not to, but I think part of my journey, if I'm going to be really good at my my leadership development work, I'm going to have some academic grounding, and I'm going to have some specific knowledge, and I can add some, more specific value for my clients if I've got that grounding. So it's just about, creating the best experience I can for the people I'm working with, and, be authentic with it, versus potentially, I think a lot of people make shit up, mate, to be honest. So just trying to be as good as I can, mate. And I know that if I'm going to be as good as I can, part of that is continuing to learn.
Yeah, awesome. Great attitude, mate. Well done. Hey, Grant, I really appreciate your time today, mate. It's been fantastic hearing your story in a little bit more detail, telling us about, the pathways that you've taken on your journey to go from working as a PE teacher at Skeggs Redlands in the northern suburbs of Sydney to attending 4 World Cups as a rugby coach, and then to what you're up to these days. And I might have to get you on for a second episode one day where you can talk specifically around leadership and how you develop leadership in your clients.
Cool, mate. Yeah, that'd be good. I appreciate it, Jay. It's been a great journey, mate. 100 odd test matches I think I've coached. So I consider myself very fortunate. So just take this moment to thank a whole lot of the people who have created the journey with me.
Awesome.
Thanks, mate.
Appreciate it, mate. Thanks so much for your time.
Good on you, James. See you, mate. Have a good weekend.
One of the key takeaways from this conversation for me was Grant's answer to one of my questions about culture. Grant identified that we can complicate culture and hide behind it, and that it ultimately comes down to relationships. It's one that I implore all coaches to work really hard at in their coming seasons. Develop relationships with your players away from sport. Learn about them and their families, what they like, and what sort of person they are. From all the coaches I talk to, the idea of building relationships is one that is constantly described as being more important than any technical or tactical knowledge. Another comment Grant makes is that he appreciates being challenged by players in the right way, because it forces him to think more deeply and grow as a coach. As coaches, we need to be open to challenge from our athletes. We cannot expect one-way traffic if we want growth in an organisation. Grant's philosophy for long-term success is nailing his short-term goals. He says if he nails today, tomorrow will look after itself. In other words, don't get too ahead of ourselves, which as coaches we can tend to do by always looking for the next big opportunity rather than focusing on doing the best in the role we're in at the time. This, in my opinion, is a great message for young coaches. Finally, for aspiring coaches, what are you willing to give up or do to follow your dream of becoming a professional coach? Will you sacrifice job and economic safety, the work hours involved, often for less money in the beginning than more stable jobs, and move away from family and friends, as well as being prepared to be sacked at some stage? These are some of the issues career coaching involves, and you need to be aware of that when you embark on your journey. As we wrap up the show, Grant is heavily active on LinkedIn. He's an extremely welcoming person, so if you have any further questions, look him up and connect with him. I'm sure he will oblige and respond to any questions you might have. I'll leave his details in the show notes. Finally, as usual, if you've enjoyed the episode, please pass it on to your friends and colleagues, spread the word about some of our other episodes, and in the meantime, keep on learning.